This week, I want to welcome Tom Rath. Tom is the best-selling author of a book I read. We were talking about this right before we started recording the show, called Strength Finders. And I remember reading this book many years ago. Dave Ramsey recommended I read the book. And I started using this book with my team. I had my family read it. My wife, Chelsea, read it. And we went through and had a great time going through, hey, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? We got to know each other better. So one of the things we're going to focus on this show is helping you discover your strengths, your weaknesses, and how to grow personally. So if you're one of those people like I am and Tom is, and you want to grow in every area of life, but specifically your character and your skills in life, this is an episode you're not going to want to miss. Also, I want to say this. Tom, his research-based books have sold over 10 million copies worldwide. And also, he was the senior scientist at Gallup for 13 years. And that's an organization that does an amazing job with their surveys and getting data. And so you're going to get this is going to be a data-driven interview here, at least a little bit with Tom. Tom, hey, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's fun to be with you.
Well, hey, first question I have for you, and this is one I read about and I really resonated with you. So I have a history of a mom who was diagnosed with cancer when I was younger. I know that you were actually diagnosed with cancer at 16 years old. How much has that driven you to, write the books you've written and start to help people develop and grow themselves? Like what role has that played in your career?
It's been a huge driving influence, and it's probably a good place to start anytime I'm getting to know people. I was diagnosed with a really rare genetic mutation when I was 16, and I discovered it because I was losing sight in one eye, and doctors had to operate. I eventually lost all sight in that eye permanently. But it also indicated that I had this rare genetic mutation that it's called von Hippel-Lindau, and it essentially shuts off the body's most powerful tumor suppressing gene. So as a result of that, doctors said, well, if you're lucky, you might live to be 45. And over the course of however long you live, you'll face cancer in your kidneys and pancreas and spine and brain, all these areas. And sure enough, I've battled cancer over the last 30 years in all those areas. So it's been an integral part of my life. But in addition to all the physical challenges, boy, has it helped me to focus real quick early on in my career on what mattered most and what I could do that would make a difference for other people even long after I'm gone. So, the scientists in the positive psychology field that I've come up in over the years, that some of them study something that they've called post-traumatic growth. So if you experience something like I did at a young age, you actually have more rapid growth coming out of it. I think, at least in my own experience, like you said, I usually talk from data, but just from my own one case study, I feel like I certainly experienced that at a young age. And in addition to all the very direct physical threats that have been a lot to deal with MRIs and CTs every 6 months and so forth over the last few decades, I've probably experienced a lot of rapid growth and hopefully some contribution to other people as a product of it as well.
Wow. One of the things that I've noticed in my, just whether it's, my faith or just research, when I look at the science and psychology of living out our purpose, one of the things I've discovered is that, it's really important that we discover, in order to live the most meaningful life possible, it's really important that we discover our unique gifts and talents and use those to serve humanity. I'm curious, from your perspective and your research, why is it so important that we discover our unique talents and strengths? Why is that important?
Well, I think right now there's just an enormous mismatch of supply and demand of talent in our world. And if you look at the markets out there, there are a lot of things that we all need, whether it's food preparation or someone refueling an airplane, taking care of one of our pets, whatever it might be. And then you have this supply, which the supply is each of us as individuals and what we could do that would make a positive contribution to another human being's life today. And I think most of us kind of sit there and say, what am I supposed to do? And we might go to what we've seen our mom do, our dad do, maybe a mentor or someone in the community. or we might just go to where we know we'll get paid so we're not in our mom or dad's basement in 3 or 4 years. And those are really not the right reasons for ending up in a job, let alone spending 4, 5, 6 years studying something and accruing all kinds of debt. So I I think we all need to step back and do a more have some type of a more deliberate process to say, what are our natural talents? What does the world need? And how can we do a better job over time bringing those two things together? Because um, I mentioned that the over under for me in my life was like 45 years of age, and I'm going to turn 48 in the next month here. So I've crossed the over under. And I would be willing to bet that I still have not even had a taste of what I might really be good at in this world yet, even at this age, just because I haven't had the opportunity to see what it might be like to be a biologist in a lab, which could be cool, or a financial planner for someone because I grew up around psychologists and teachers. So I got into this line of work. Right. So I think we just need a better process to help people see where they can contribute in the world.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I know that, and by the way, it's just, I mean, I've read so often, there have been people that, this always blows my mind that there's a lot of people that didn't figure out what they were doing until they were even in their 40s or 50s or later on in life. This is an interesting one, but there's a former actor I met who turned into a P90X star. His name's Tony Horton. And I went
Mm-hmm.
out to interview him in LA at his home, and we hung out a little bit. And he was sharing with me that he was living in LA and about 40 years old as an actor, and living out of his car because he just couldn't pick up an acting job. So he just started kind of getting into working out a little bit, and then eventually, a few years later, somehow turned into the star of P90X and the whole fitness industry and made millions. And there are a lot of people like that, right? Who and maybe it was a career change later on in life. They're saying, I had a grandfather like that. He worked at a telephone company in Ohio, and around Dayton, Ohio, for his first 44 years of life. And when he turned 44, he said, you know what? I don't want to work on telephone poles anymore, like, in these cold Ohio winters. So he started a swim park they took their life savings, him and my grandmother, and they started this lake in Ohio called Winona Lake. And it was a big swim park and campground, and did that for the next 52 years until he passed away at 96. And so anyways, I think for a lot of people that, we find kind of this our calling, even things we're more passionate about, not just making money, but our passions later on in life. And one of the things I was so interested in a book you wrote, the book was called Well-Being. And what you get into in that book is there's really sort of 5 areas we need to focus on in life if we're going to live the fullest life possible. Can you walk us through those 5 areas that are just really important for us maxing out our life?
Yeah, and that was interesting for me because when we were working on that book and doing some of the research, we didn't really know um, what areas were most important in terms of actually predicting all kinds of outcomes about how people enjoyed their life, felt good about their purpose, and all these things. And we stepped back and said, well, should we uh, ask let people prioritize if financial is more important than social or your community time and all this? And eventually we just said, let's look at what comes out of the data and what the essential elements are. And the data told us there are kind of 5 that are big buckets or big predictors. And the first one was really what we called career well-being. So it's, what are you doing with your work each day that makes a difference? And that was even a more central locus of our overall life satisfaction, well-being than I ever would have guessed. So the first one was career well-being. The next one was social well-being. And I think of all the kind of old, highly esteemed psychologists that I've been fortunate enough to grow up around, like they just disagree on everything. They're kind of cantankerous old dudes. But the only thing they do agree on is that they would all tell you that relationships are the single most important element and the single most important predictor of our overall well-being in life. My
Mm.
my graduate advisors were uh, in Marty Seligman's program at Penn was a guy named Chris Peterson, who was probably the nicest guy I've ever met. But he started on the first day of graduate school, put a slide up on the PowerPoint or whatever, and he said, I'm going to summarize this whole graduate program in one slide. And that slide just said, other people matter. And it was kind of Chris's mantra for life. And it's so true that, I mean, if all of us could wake up every morning and just read something that said other people matter, we'd be better off, right?
Yeah, I love it. There's a and I'm sure as a Gallup scientist you're going to have seen some of this research, but it's always amazing to me when you look at these studies, and if somebody is pursuing self gratification, just self happiness, how they end up unhappy, right? I mean, there's some research that really shows, hey, you pursue self happiness, you're not going to be that happy, versus if you pursue contribution to others and family and social interactions, you will be happy. And so oftentimes so much of it comes down to, are you chasing the right thing?
That's you just hit on something that is probably the most important or impactful discovery I've had from my own self-development and from all the research I've looked at. And that is that, the most important thing you can do for your own well-being and for the people you love and care about and for the well-being of your community is really just to wake up in the morning and ask yourself, how can you help another person and make a contribution to their lives? And, even when I'm talking to a friend, and we all have friends who are really struggling right now, right? Everybody does. I mean, I kind of look at my experience, and even though I'm blind in one side, people can't tell because I wear a prosthetic, and so like I'll bump into people at a Starbucks or a grocery store every day, and they think I'm just some idiot who can't get out of my own way. And really, it's just because I can't see past my nose on one side, right? And of course, I've got this script down now after 30 years. I just profusely apologize and back up and everything else because I really can't help it, and I don't explain anything. But it's such an interesting lens into what's going on with the other person that day, right? And
Mm.
so, and especially if they're really having a tough day and they're in a hostile place, I work even harder to see if I can get them into a good spot, right? So it's, I mean, if you kind of take your day through that lens of doing something for another person or contribution back to the world, I think that's the most important daily orientation, even for self growth and self development, as you talk about it. It's so important.
Yeah, one of the things I'd be interested to get your take on is we talk about self-development. I see this sort of field. It's interesting. It's like, I look back hundreds of years, and I was thinking about this the other day. Were there self-help books? And now I think there's a lot of religious books. I know, and then I thought back, well, I'm like, well, the Stoics, in a way, a lot of those writings seem very self-help like to me. But I'm curious, from your standpoint, what is something in the field today of sort of, self-help, personal growth, if we read those books, what is something that you maybe have read over the years and you're like, I think people get this completely wrong. This is not really a great way to grow yourself. And what is something that maybe, well, let's start there. What is something that the self-help just category and personal growth, most authors and maybe even experts get wrong?
Yeah, there are two big things, but the first one, I'm going to kind of take this back to I was just talking with a group of thinkers on this, that it goes back to like early childhood times. And I wrote, when I wrote the book, How Full is Your Bucket, that turned into a whole series for kids, this How Full is Your Bucket for kids that's used in school. So I've gotten pretty close to kind of illustrated books that are foundational that kids read in K-12 systems in the United States. And the one that I think is beautiful and well intended, but may lead all of us in the wrong direction. Honestly, it's the little engine that could. And it's kind of this. I think I can. I think I can. I knew I could. I knew I could. And we all grow up listening to that. And I grow up reading it to our kids when they're young. Um, but it kind of instills this thought of I can be anything I want to be if I try hard enough. And
Mm,
I think that's just wrong. Um,
yeah.
Everything I've worked on would suggest that you can't be anything you want to be, but you can be a heck of a lot more of who you already are. And so it's, I
Wow.
think instead of saying, hey, Johnny or um, Susie, whatever, you can be anything you want to be, I think we got to start helping young people to think about how do you spend a big chunk of your childhood learning about all the things you could be, and then dedicating more of your time and development and schooling and early work experience and everything to areas where you could experience great success and make a big contribution to other people and enjoy it in the process. It's kind of, the later life manifestation of the little engine that could is probably when you go to your commencement speech and some random person says go follow your passions, which is equal parts wrong in my opinion. Where it's kind of like that's kind of like, oh, go do whatever you want to do, and it implies that if golfing recreationally is what you really want to do, that's important and you should go do it. When in reality, I think by that time we need to be thinking about what could I do that makes a positive contribution to the world. So please don't go manufacture cigarettes to make a lot of money if that's your passion. The world doesn't need that, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's some nuance we can add to those foundational messages that could help kids in the future.
And I love you saying this, Tom, because I think it's a really important message, and I think some of it has to do with perspective. For me, I'm going to come at it from a more faith-driven, divine perspective, and thinking, okay, not the I think I can or what could you be, but what were you created to be? Right.
Mm-hmm.
I had an opportunity to work with,
Definitely.
I'm thinking like Olympic swimmers in the past. And one of the things that I know by looking at their builds, Michael Phelps is an example of this. It's like, okay, you were created, you were built uniquely to be able to swim fast. I mean, when you look at his body type, his hand size, the whole thing, a very similar thing of a tall basketball player. It's like you weren't created to be a figure skater, right? You were created to do this. And so I think being able to tap into what are you uniquely created to do that really aligns with your strengths and your talents. One of the things that you actually did so well in the book Strength Finders 2.0 of helping people discover their strengths. I think that's one of the things I loved about your message about personal growth was discovery. And by the way, John Maxwell was the first person I heard say this. He said, don't work on your weaknesses, work on your strengths. Go and find your strengths, work on developing those before you work on developing your weaknesses. And I thought there was a lot of wisdom there. And then again, your book helped me in figuring some of those out. Like one of the things I was a learner was my number one. I know when I took Strength Finders, and then my mother-in-law always joke because she was 32, like it was her last, and that was
Yeah,
my first. And so anytime there's anything, I'm like, oh, okay, like I'm excited to learn. And she's like, you learn it, and then give me she's like, give me the cliff notes or the summary on it. I'm like, okay.
that's
So,
cool.
anyways, and you were going to hit on the second part. So one of the things you talked about here, and that was lumped in there. You said that people get wrong when it comes to personal growth. So you mentioned the thing, I can be anything. What's the other thing that people get wrong in that space?
Well, I think it's kind of like you were talking about it, and I love the way you talked about what you're created to be. Where over time, it's the people who experience the most rapid growth, just kind of mathematically, are the people who invest more hours in areas where they do have some natural talent, right? And the kind of counterbalance to that is if you have someone who's gotten all the way to, let's call it 25 years old, and they're still just trying to be well rounded and kind of a jack of all trades and good at everything, then all of those areas are essentially watered down. And they really, it almost, if you think about it from an investment of time standpoint, if you spend your whole life trying to be a little bit good at everything, it kind of eliminates your odds of being great at anything, right?
Hmm.
So I think to your point, um, do you want to be a Michael Phelps? If you happen to find that one in 10,000 thing, you could do better than anyone else. Or the counter argument I think I used as an example in the book Strengths Finder 2.0 was you've got the kind of Rudy Rudiger thing where he tried super hard to be good or okay at something that he didn't have all the kind of natural physical traits and talent for. And eventually, after years and years of hard work and practice, that got him a couple plays in a college football game, right? So do you want to invest a bunch of time for something like that, or do you want to invest hundreds of hours in an area where you do have a lot of physical, psychological, natural talent where you could kind of be one in a million and make a big contribution to people in the world. So I think the way you talked about that is so much more uh, accurate and promising in terms of the contribution it can make.
Yeah, I'm curious, and when I read your bio that you'd worked that long at Gallup, I was really, really impressed with that. I love going to Gallup. I love going to Pew Research as well, and just getting the data today. It's always so surprising to me sometimes when you look at, and it's also so helpful to be able to see what are the current trends today. I was looking at some trends here this week about how less religious people are. You look at like Gen Z, so how God has sort of been moved out of society since really. Probably the 1960s. And so and then that means certain things for society. So I just think learning these things and knowing the data is so important. I'm curious, in all of your years working at Gallup, what were some of the most shocking findings that you found as you did your research?
Yeah, I think the one of the most interesting things about is and it's important. It's neat that you point that out because like what Gallup and Pew Research and a lot of others have done that I sure admire deeply is um, kind of giving people voice. So these make sure that these random samplings in many cases of people all over the world, and I mean Gallup's done it better globally than anyone, 100 and probably 130 to 150 countries, that their voices are being heard instead of hidden in a corner or suppressed, so we kind of know what the world's thinking. Um, and it's, I mean, if you ask it at that high of a level, I think it's kind of one of the most important discoveries. If you look at the 100-year history of the big contribution those companies and Gallup had in particular, is uh, helping us all to see how you can survey 1,000 people to represent hundreds of millions. And if you do that systemically around the world, we kind of get to know each other better as a populace, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Yep.
that's on kind of big trends all the way from if you look at civil rights to kind of gender rights over the years, and in my lifetime to you can see through the Gallup data 10, 15 years in advance some of the trend lines on openness to same-sex marriage and the like, and you can see where that's coming, right? And
Yep.
it's kind of fascinating to see how it's given all of us a better voice, and to look at the way that that's changed and maybe accelerated the conversation over time, and so our politicians know what we're thinking as well, right? That's kind of fun. So that anyhow, that's more of a kind of at a global
Yeah.
level. But I focused a lot on the management and engagement and health and well-being side of things too. So
You,
that's
you know,
it.
Gallup did this poll I recently saw, and they looked at values, and so values per country. What were the highest level? And I think they ranked like 50. What is your highest value? And I think one that was actually very telling to me was, we looked at the United States and areas like Europe, and one that had really gone down. Now it was still high, but it was less than it had been. Was again family and faith, like religion, those had both really continued to drop. You saw more of the materialism start to creep up, but just how much faith and family were in areas like South America, where family was still a much greater priority than certain other areas of the world. And I noticed this when my wife and I spent a couple of years living in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that happens there, I mean, you see, it's a more family driven culture than I would say the
Mhm.
United States is. And it's like on Sundays, families are every family, and not just your small family, your extended family. Everybody is getting together, going to a park or going to the beach or doing something. And I love that. It was something I really, really appreciated about the culture, and something I started to miss. And also, as you're saying, there are certain things that concern me when I read about Gen Z, some of their beliefs. And again, I think religion is particularly important because I think it's really your framework, and it creates structure for how do you discern and decide what's moral and what's not, and it helps create the frameworks of society. So knowing that there's this level of relativism creeping in, and that's continued to decline, it's like, well, how are we going to decide this structure? And so anyways, I it's that's just a little rant for me, but I do think that's why this research to me, it is so valuable.
But if you, it's interesting though, like when we were talking about the well-being conversation, Josh, um, the thing that struck me and my co-author Jim Harder, who I wrote that book with and did a lot of the research with, when we were looking at those data, you kind of have these big buckets of things that cluster together with well-being, but there is clearly a major current of spirituality that was running through all of those elements, and
Mm,
it was so embedded in what we could see that it just didn't pull out like its own independent factor, right? And to that point, I think one thing I'm seeing in current data from a variety of sources is that people entering the workforce today, that generation, may have much lower levels of attendance at worship services and claiming that they uh, pray or meditate daily. I think those are some of the questions asked.
hmm
But there's a much higher level of expectation about mission and purpose of work and meaning and connectedness with some of the work that people are doing. So I, I'm seeing something that's spiritual but different in
Yeah.
some of those data.
Well,
If that
well,
makes sense, and
what
it's
it makes total sense. I mean,
yeah.
here's the thing. I believe everybody has a God. It's what's number one in your hierarchy, in your,
Mhm.
is it, I mean, it could be family, it could be your government, it could be, a social group, but everybody has a God, And so I think also everyone is spiritual. I think we're not a body with a soul, we're a soul with a body. And so I really see it as what you're saying here is that, like, and I've seen this in our work. It's like, well, because people don't have a mission, maybe they're not connected to a church in whatever religion it might be, because they don't have this place of worship, they're now trying to find and fill this thing of their soul in their work. And so this is where we see a lot of social justice movements. It's like, I want to do something that matters. I want to do something with meaning. I want to do something that feels, and so they're searching for it in their work, which as you said, there are and could be some potential, or I think you were insinuating maybe there could be some potential benefits, because if spirituality is in your work, or there's a level of meaning to your work, like you're looking for work, like money doesn't matter to me as much as doing something meaningful, right?
Mhm.
If that's versus, I think my dad's generation, baby boomers was a little bit more, well, listen, I'm going to do whatever job will put food on the table, you know?
Mhm.
And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that, because I could see, I could see that maybe being one of the, trade-offs.
I do, and I think back to that foundational research we were doing on well-being. You can't just take religion or spirituality and put it in a nice little compact ball to measure
Mm-hmm.
in the same way with some of those other things that I was talking about, right? So I see some changes, good and bad, positive, kind of what would traditionally be positive and negative, but it's interspersed in between a lot of different factors there. So some of it comes into relationships, some of it comes into what we do with our mission and purpose in our career. Some of it comes into, like you were mentioned, how and what we do in the community as well that's not paid work, right? And the boy, to your point, the relationship with money as a primary outcome or dependent variable or priority, that's really changing as well too. So I think in a positive
Yeah.
way. So I mean, the generation I grew up in, it was kind of like work was work because you got paid to do it, and if you happen to enjoy it, that's fine, but don't tell anybody about it. Or right? I mean, it was such a different mindset in my dad's generation and my grandparents' generation, and that keeps getting a little bit better with each successive generation in my lifetime, at least I think. And so I'm starting to see some positive changes there, and I think I even have to be careful around my children because they don't think about money in the same way that I was raised to think about it as a positive
But,
to have more
but,
of
but,
it or
but, but,
something,
but
right?
Tom, well, yeah, but well, one of the things I'm curious about is that, do you think that's because there's been so much comfort? When you have a generation, they have so much comfort. On Maslow's hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
Well, I am safe. I am secure. So I'm not even going to think about not being safe, secure, because I've just always been. So I can be on that one of those higher rungs. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, I do. Then I was reading a local newspaper today here. I live in Arlington, Virginia, and the local unemployment rate is 2.1%. And like I've never even imagined that a number like that is statistically possible in a community with 200,000 people, right? To your point, that's like 100, 200 year record of comfort, right? So
Yeah.
yes, that makes me wonder about to your where we started talking about all the battles I had when I was 16 years old, and in my experience, some discomfort was good, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to talk about strengths here for a minute because, again, that's something that again, my first exposure to you was, wow, you helped me discover my strengths. And it was so valuable. And I thought, well, okay, I'm a learner and I had a few others on there. And I thought, okay, these are ones that I really am going to embrace and actually pour into because I kind of took what John Maxwell said. Listen, discover take your strengths and multiply them and focus on growing in those. And I thought, well, I need to find my strengths. And then I read Strength Finders and started finding those and thinking about those more and then pouring time into those. What are some ways that people, now, one, I do want to call out your book. And so people can go and go to Amazon.com and just buy Strength Finders 2.0. It's one of the very best tools to find out what you're great at. There's another one I love. Actually, we mentioned Patrick Lencioni. He's got a book called Working Genius. But those are the two that we've used the most, that and Strength Finders in my organizations that I have. So I want to encourage people to go and check out your book on that. What are some ways, just generally, though, that people can discover their strengths?
I think the the thing I've learned over the years beyond just StrengthsFinder is not as a clear and strong tool there is once you've done that, the next most valuable thing you can do is to always keep an eye out to help other people uncover areas of hidden talent that they might not have noticed. I often talk about how the only reason I got into this business of books and writing nonfiction was because even after I'd worked with my grandfather, Don Clifton, who was really the developer of StrengthsFinder, on that project, I was the project leader on it. And we'd been working together for a couple of years, and I'd taken it 7 or 8 times while we were testing StrengthsFinder out back in the real late 90s. And even after all that, I was just a numbers guy and a researcher, and I never thought I'd write anything or I hadn't even shared my personal story we talked about. But then during that process, Don was diagnosed with stage 4 gastroesophageal cancer. And I knew what that meant because I'd been battling all this stuff. So we flew around and tried to keep him alive as long as we could. But in the middle of that process, I wrote him a like 15-page handwritten note about how much he'd meant to me through all my tough challenges and all this stuff. And after I gave it to him, 2 days later, he was, of course, really moved by that. And I'm glad I did that before he died. Um, but he said, I've noticed you have a real talent for bringing things to life with words. And I think we should work on a book on this topic in the next 2 months. And it was the only time he ever let on, he was such a positive guy, that he knew how severe his condition was. But I was so insecure about my writing. An English teacher told me to stick with numbers that I never would have written a single word for public consumption if not for that day. And so even after all the StrengthsFinder stuff, taken 8 times, it was just one day where one person said, "Here's a talent that I hadn't noticed, and here's a specific challenge to see if you could build on it." And so in 2 months, we put together the first draft of a book that was called "How Full Is Your Bucket?" And the rest is kind of history there. So, it was just kind of that one moment of Don spotting something that absolutely no one had ever noticed or considered, and that changed everything, right? So, I think the single most valuable strength we talk about I have learner in my top 5 too, and love that one. And but people always ask me what's the best one, And I think the best strength is if you can help another human being to spot a talent they haven't noticed. And so if we put that lens on and say our job is to be kind of strengths finders of other people, I think that's a really good way to get started. And I've been doing this with my kids since they're young and friends, and boy, do people appreciate those observations.
I love it. That's such a great answer. For everyone else listening here, I'd love for you to share, what is your best piece of advice for anyone here who wants to live the most meaningful life possible?
Oh, that's a great question. That if you spend time every day thinking about what you can do to improve the life of another human being and make a contribution to your community, that will create subsequent upward spirals that lift you up in the process.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so good. I mean, so much of what you shared, it's synergistic. It's very related, right? I mean, you've been impacted in a way to where you were taught about just the power of contribution and then looking at the contribution of others. And I think you've made a great contribution in your books, because I think one of those themes in there is discover your strengths so you can use them for the good of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's such a powerful message there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, of course, the one caveat that I know you've done a lot of important work on is that, as I stepped back and reflected after dealing with all my physical challenges for a quarter century, your physical health is the one place where it goes back like the airplane oxygen mask thing, where you have to make sure that you're putting your own kind of sleep and movement and all that and your health first for the sake of being your best for other people. So that's as I went real deep on all my learnings as a professional patient over 30 years, that was really clear to me where if I go out and if I don't get a good night's sleep and then I'm slumped in a chair working all day and I eat a bunch of fried foods or whatever, I don't have the energy I need to be a good dad to two really active kids who are 12 and 14 right now. Right.
Yeah.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, I do think the one caveat to all this kind of external focus is you got to make sure you're putting your body and your energy first so you can do your best for other people. And that's been a really important learning, at least for me over the years.
Well, Tom, any last words for everybody? I want to direct people towards your books, and so I want to encourage people to check out. Again, I know you've written a lot of great books. I've mentioned Strength Finders 2.0 several times because I've loved the book so much. I've recommended it and handed it out to a lot of people and we've used it in my business and organizations, and so I've loved it. And so I want to say thanks. And everybody, again, just want to encourage you to check out Tom Rath here with us, and we've been talking about a lot of stuff, discovering your strength. We've talked about the power of contribution. We've talked about the top things that leaders need to do now and in the future. And any last thoughts, Tom?
No, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thanks for your time.
Everybody, I want to say thanks so much again for listening. I want to thank Tom Rath for coming on the show today. And hey, let me know if you're watching on YouTube in the comment section, your biggest takeaway from one of the pieces of wisdom that Tom shared with us today. Thanks everybody for watching, and thanks again to Tom Rath.